Welcome back to part 2 of the lecture. In this part, we're going to look at how certain forms of cultural expression can be used to shape national identities. To begin, it's best to be clear about a distinction that's often made between high and low or popular culture. The notion of high culture is typically used to refer to cultural products usually associated with art forms connected to the upper classes in society. Opera, painting, or ballet, for example. This sort of culture is typically contrasted with low or popular culture. Think of popular culture as the culture of the masses, the music we listen to daily, the television we watch, the internet content we consume, all those cute kitten videos on YouTube, for example. Of course, the division between high culture and popular culture is not nearly as clean as I've just suggested. People of every social class consume both types of culture, and even any lines that might be drawn between high and popular forms of cultural expression can in fact be blurred. For this part of the lecture, I'm going to focus on the visual arts in Canada as a form of cultural expression. In particular, I want to look at paintings by the Group of Seven. While this art certainly falls within the realm of high culture, what is compelling to me about it is the way in which these paintings were used to very consciously create a sense of what Canada was in the early 20th century. In the days before internet and television, the powerful visual images created in paintings were an effective way to convey and to communicate more widely a sense of who a people thought they were, to construct identities, in other words. In Canada, perhaps the most well-known artists in this respect are the Group of Seven. We should begin, I think, with painter Tom Thomson, perhaps the most famous Canadian painter to be associated with the group, even if he wasn't technically a part of it. Thomson was born near Pickering, Ontario, but grew up on a farm near Owen Sound. He went to college in Seattle, Washington, where he developed skills to work in commercial art as an engraver. When Thomson returned to Canada, he attended night school to develop his technical skills, and his art in fact flourished under the guidance of painter J.E.H. MacDonald, the anchor of the design team at Grip Limited, which at the time was a well-known commercial art firm where Thomson worked. In 1912, Thomson completed a series of sketches and paintings while on a fishing trip to Algonquin Park. His art revealed a vision of expansive wilderness, untouched by humanity. One of these sketches was then transformed in studio into his first major painting, a northern lake, completed in 1913. The painting was then purchased by the Ontario government for $250. To put that in perspective, Thomson's weekly salary was $35. During the fall of 1914, he camped in Algonquin Park with his friends A.Y. Jackson, Arthur Lismer, and Frederick Varley. In Algonquin, he began to create a particular kind of landscape art that became the basis for a style that ultimately brought national prominence to what would become the Group of Seven. It's important to recognize that Thomson explicitly discussed his ideas about landscape art and its relationship to a developing Canadian consciousness. He was very deliberately trying to create a Canadian style of painting. Thomson spent the spring and fall seasons sketching in Algonquin, working as a guide there in the summer months. In the winter, he would return to Toronto to paint in a shack that was built for him beside what came to be known as the Group of Seven's studio building in Toronto. Perhaps the most compelling part of Thomson's life story is his death, which is in fact shrouded in mystery to this day. Thomson went out alone on a fishing trip on July 8, 1917, and his body was found floating in the water on the 16th. The official cause of death was recorded at the time as accidental drowning, but theories abound. Murder? Suicide? We don't know. Whatever the reason for his death, Thomson came to be constructed as the archetypal Canadian, mysterious, strange, deeply connected to nature, a socially awkward, reclusive, lone wolf. More significant for the art world was the fact that at the time of his death, he left behind 50 canvases, 300 sketches. Paintings such as the Jack Pine and the West Wind would go on to become iconic images of Canadian nature. Thompson's paintings can now easily fetch in the millions of dollars when they come up for auction. As I mentioned earlier, Tom Thompson was never actually a member of the Group of Seven, though many of his friends and associates were, and they all certainly shared in Thompson's approach to painting Canadian landscape. The original members, Carmichael, Harris, Jackson, Johnson, Lismer, MacDonald, and Varley, all pictured here, founded the group in 1920. Except for Harris, they all worked as commercial artists. Harris was independently wealthy. He was heir to the Massey Harris farm machinery empire. The group rebelled against the Canadian art establishment, which they considered too imitative of European art, and they rebelled against 19th century constraints of romantic naturalism. They sought a more equal relationship between art and nature. Harris believed that a nation identifies itself with its land, and that no virile people could remain subservient to and dependent upon the creations in art of other people. Because they often painted together, either in the studio or on the land, their paintings developed along somewhat similar lines. After a visit to the north shore of Lake Superior, Harris began to simplify the color and layouts of his paintings, a trend then followed by others in the group. By the mid-1920s, Harris had actually reduced his paintings to a very few simplified forms. Their views of the Canadian landscape became entrenched as a uniquely Canadian style, largely through their own self-promotion, and with the support of the National Gallery of Canada, whose director began buying the paintings and ensured the group's work was well represented in international art shows. You can still go to the Canadian National Gallery and see a whole room full of Group of Seven paintings. Various painters joined and left the Group of Seven, and by 1933, the group had essentially disbanded. Still, its members became influential teachers who influenced future generations of Canadian artists, further entrenching their Canadian approach to painting. The Group of Seven attempted to paint the Canadian meta-narrative, the big story that explained how the Canadian national character came to be, in sync with the natural environment. The landscape depicted by the group were uncontrollable and impenetrable. Nature and wilderness are not inviting or comfortable to humans. Instead, nature is overpowering. Significantly, critics have also noted that the group's work tends to eliminate the human presence. In doing so, some suggest that their art should be seen as a recolonization of Aboriginal people. The group portrays nature and wilderness as savage and dangerous, just as European settlers would have experienced it. This is a dark side of nature, and not as Indigenous Canadians would have understood it. Myths are developed and adapted over time to create national identity. But perhaps one of the most coherent and consistent of these myths in the Canadian context is the notion of Canada as a northern wilderness. And the Group of Seven played a key role in shaping this notion. Yet these painters were not necessarily the first to articulate this vision. Decades earlier, the Canada First movement brought together Canadian intellectuals of the day in an effort to explain and shape a Canadian national identity. This movement began in Ottawa in the late 1860s, but it shifted to Toronto by the mid-1870s. The organization was grounded in the belief that Canada was a Britain of the North, a northern kingdom with a unique and distinctive character that derived from its northern location.
I thought it was going to be calling me too.
And its heritage of northern races. Northerness, landscape, nature, wilderness, the environment. They were all used to racialize what it meant to be Canadian. This reinforced similarities between Canada and Britain and other northern civilized
The
nations,
means to get
and in
alcohol.
particular distinguished Canada from the United States. The Canada Firsters
How you
constructed the
doing?
U.S. as degenerate and tame.
Are you in bed right
They
now, like
argued
sleeping?
that Canada's northern
Happy New
climate
Year!
kept it uncontaminated by the
Yeah, I know
weaker
it's New
southern
Year, though.
races. Indeed, its climate was a fundamental political and social advantage,
You're welcome.
because in their racist view, natural selection would ensure that the Negro problem,
That was
as they
it.
called it, would be avoided.
Bye.
The movement didn't even consider the United States to
He
be an
doesn't.
Anglo-Saxon country.
I feel like he's lying. He actually is lying because he's friends with Nathaniel, and Nathaniel's 19.
It hadn't contaminated
Who's
its
Nathaniel?
northern
Remember
waters.
the gay guy that I told you about?
In short, the Canada First movement
He went to Marcy. He went to night school with me.
ideas of the North, nature, the land, and race to construct a Canadian identity. Here, nature is seen in a positive light.
Imagine my teacher actually wants him to
While
watch
nature
this.
and the environment were used by the Canada Firsters to distinguish Canada from the United States,
I have to watch
the
it
group
for
of
exam,
Seven's
so I
efforts
actually
to
know what's
create
happening.
and paint a national consciousness were aimed at differentiating Canada from Britain
I should've told
and
him I
the
was
United
like,
States. It did this by promoting the
I kept
symbolism
waiting
of
for
an
you to-
unpeopled and rugged
Oh, I got
wilderness.
nervous.
Canada's northernness was
I
not
can't
American.
read like that, maybe.
Its wilderness was not European.
Oh, I should have asked him if he celebrated
What we
Super Bowl.
have then,
If
with
he
the
was
group
going
of
to that
seven,
Super Bowl
is a
thing.
deliberate attempt to construct Canada's national identity at the beginning
I
of
can
the
FaceTime
20th
me.
century.
I think of me.
Art
It doesn't have. That's not gonna help
Was
us. He
seen
needs
as
that
a very
Western.
useful and
But
appropriate
he might
vehicle
not
for
be
doing
right
so.
now, because he might be celebrating.
We'll see in the next part of the lecture
Super Bowl
that
results.
Mexico
I
has
don't
its
know if
own
it goes
tradition
back.
of painting identity
But they're
as
like
well.
buddy.
But that's it for,
Is that a
for part
dildo?
2 of the lecture. We'll see you in part 3. Bye for now.
Bro, I use that to figure myself.